We're now here again at the Net Zero Nuclear booth, and our theme for today at this panel will be the youth perspective on a nuclear powered world. So, is nuclear forever? That's the question that we have to discuss today. So, now we have listened to a lot of Europeans about how the nuclear sector is evolving in Europe and also the advocacy. Then we move to Australia, to a whole other continent. William Shackle, can you tell us about who you are and what you have been up to the last couple of months? We have seen your face appear on television screens all over the world, and also you had an interview with Macron in the start of COP. So can you tell us about who you are and what you're up to?
Well, thank you for having me, and sorry I was a bit late to this event today. I got lost, admittedly. My name's Will Shackle, and I'm a 17-year-old nuclear energy advocate from Australia. And I'm the founder of Australia's first youth-led campaign for nuclear energy, Nuclear for Australia. The situation in Australia is a very interesting one. We're the only member of the G20 with a ban on nuclear energy, so we're not even able to consider it. And I say bans with a plural because there's multiple bans in Australia. It's not just at a federal level. There's 2 bans at a federal level in Australia which completely outlaw nuclear energy and also various stages of the nuclear fuel cycle. But in addition to that, there's also local bans on top of that, and then particular regions, particular council areas, which declare themselves as nuclear-free zones. So when it comes to nuclear energy, you couldn't find a place more opposed to it than perhaps Australia. But the difference is, from what I'm able to find, it's only our decision makers which are opposed to nuclear energy, because the majority of Australians, poll after poll shows that a majority of Australians support nuclear energy, and not only support lifting all the prohibitions and moratoriums, but in addition to that, support having a civil nuclear power industry in Australia. So Australia's not on track to reach our emissions targets. We can't currently consider the role of nuclear energy, and when I see nuclear energy as one of the cleanest and most reliable technologies possibly available to us, for a country with the largest uranium reserves in the world, about to get floating small modular reactors in the name of our AUKUS submarines for our national security, it begs the question why we can't have reactors on land for our energy security and also to address climate change. So it's a very interesting situation we're currently experiencing in Australia, and I'm fighting for the bans on nuclear energy to be lifted so we can consider the critical role of nuclear energy in addressing the climate and energy crisis we're currently undergoing.
William, you're on another continent, but it seems like when I'm following on your social media and what you're releasing, it's the same kinds of topics and the same kinds of difficulties that the European young pro-nuclear advocates are fighting that you're also doing in Australia. So is it also natural gas or nuclear in Australia, or is it coal or nuclear? What is the perspective and what are you facing now? Because I think it was today you just got 5,000 signatures for your pledge for nuclear in Australia. So can you tell us a little bit about more? What is the alternatives in Australia?
So currently the plan is to go down a 100% renewable energy pathway, and that will largely be supported by natural gas, according to our Minister for Climate Change and Energy, which obviously isn't a solution to climate change. If we were serious about climate change, we wouldn't be using natural gas as that transition sort of fuel. And they're speculating that that will have to be a central part of our energy mix into the 2040s, which I just don't think is a solution to climate change. I think my general opinion, and this is something that I think all nuclear advocates should do, is to not rule out the potential of renewables. Renewables are hugely beneficial, especially for a country like Australia, where we've got vast amounts of land, we've got vast access to the sun, and of course we've got a lot of access to the wind as well. We are well suited to renewables, and that's why we've already got around 30% renewables in our grid. The difficulty becomes, once you've got enough renewables, and we've seen this in other nations, that the problems with intermittency, when the sun doesn't shine, when the wind doesn't blow, you ultimately need a reliable source of power, and nuclear is well suited to be that reliable source of power to fill that gap. As a base load source of power, the most reliable source of power that exists according to its capacity factor. So the argument I would have is, as Australia ramps up our renewable generation, we should keep on doing that. If there becomes a time where we're still needing to have natural gas to support those renewables, that nuclear is a far better alternative due to its credentials as one of the cleanest forms of power available to us. So that's why I'm specifically advocating for the bans on nuclear to be lifted. And as you said, my petition, I'm calling on the Australian delegation here at COP28 to support nuclear energy and to at very least consider it. And that I've been thrilled to see that petition has got over 5,700 signatures and counting. So the Australian people are right behind the nuclear movement. They want a reliable, clean source of power in order to help us get to net zero. And importantly, nuclear energy is just one part of the energy mix that Australians want. We support renewables, but we think that nuclear is needed ultimately to get to net zero.
So what we're hearing is that from all of you, there is a argument that there is support in the population, but the politicians are left behind. There is a great need for more green, stable electricity, and you're getting it from fossil fuels, and wind and solar cannot do the job by itself. So help me crack that nut. Why are we not investing and doing more nuclear around the world? Why is this still in like some kinds of purgatory where we see a lot of promises, but we don't see a lot of results? So does any one of you like want to crack that nut with me? Why do we have that much support, but we don't see any results?
So I think whilst a majority of people support nuclear energy, and that's something we're seeing in Australia and undoubtedly in other countries, that's also the case, people aren't actually energized about it, which I know is slightly ironic when you're talking about nuclear energy. So the fact is that people have that underlying support, they are open to it, but for whatever reason, they're not able to energetically get behind nuclear and push it in the same way they might push raising the issue of climate change.
But isn't that because people are afraid of being like associated with nuclear power?
I think there is a certain degree to that, but I don't think that advocating for nuclear energy is a very emotional issue in the same way that advocating for more action on climate change is an emotional issue. People, if that makes sense.
But you also have to remember that nuclear has this history with it, of course. And it's not the same about just acting for climate change. So not seeing it as an emotional advocacy, can you please explain?
Yeah. So I think from what we're seeing in Australia, people don't really buy a lot of that. There's a very, very small energetic anti-nuclear movement. And obviously it's very easy to get emotional against nuclear energy, but that's becoming a really small minority. I think in Australia, about 18% of people identify as anti-nuclear. And there's a very small minority who, you know, regardless of what you say, will just go after you in terms of nuclear. But that's decreasing quite significantly. The issue is it's very, very difficult to be very emotionally invested in nuclear energy, especially when there is alternatives that do exist. And I think at the same time, no one's really emotionally invested in renewables. It's very hard to get emotionally invested in renewables, or nuclear, any technology. It's much easier to, you know, get all emotional about the fact that the climate is changing and we're going to face the impacts of it. The children may die, all of that sort of rhetoric. It's much easier to advocate for than a solution which doesn't have that same emotional basis to it, if that makes sense. And from my point of view, very little can be achieved from just mentioning the problem to people. You know, it's all good to make sure that people are aware of the issues with climate change or with energy security, and it's much easier to make people aware of that. The more difficult thing is to get people excited and to get people emotional about the solutions, because there's no use raising the problem to decision makers if you're not actually presenting an alternative to decision makers and solutions to decision makers that they can actually embrace to solve these issues. So I think that's the difficulty we have, is wrapping around some emotional appeal around the idea of nuclear energy, which is able to energize people and is able to make them really passionately advocate for nuclear energy as a solution to climate change, if that makes sense.
And it's these conversations that count, because if we want to solve climate change, we have to do these difficult conversations. You sometimes, as a young advocate, have to kick in the door and actually take the consequences of maybe saying something that you maybe regret the day after, but you have to kick in the door sometimes. And we see that in all countries. Like, I've seen you people on television or in articles being interviewed where you're actually showing emotion. You're showing emotion. You're showing that you care about the climate. But is this just a trend? Because this growth in nuclear advocacy, it has grown a lot the last 5 years. But what I sometimes can be a little bit afraid of is that if this just a trend that will just disappear in some years. So will nuclear, as the title of the debate, actually be forever? Or is it just a new trend that a lot of young people jump on and it's exciting and it makes a lot of sense? But in the future, you'll just find a new thing to actually advocate for. Or is it something that we will stick with?
Well, I think people are starting to realize some of the complicated factors involved in an energy transition. And as we go further and further towards net zero, there are going to be more questions asked, and people are going to realize that it's much, much more complicated than just installing solar panels and wind turbines everywhere. We're certainly finding that in Australia, there's a huge NIMBYism sort of argument emerging against renewables in agricultural communities and also Indigenous communities, where there's becoming huge pushback because of the fact that there is going to have to start being such a much more nuanced conversation around the energy transition and some of the unforeseen complications which are brought by it. Nuclear energy will always have a role, because I think why nuclear energy is becoming relevant now is because people are starting to think about it a bit more and starting, I guess, to be a bit more pragmatic around the energy transition. And once you start, I think, thinking through that lens of pragmatism, nuclear energy is a very, very appealing option, you know, whether it's due to the energy density or the fact it's got incredible credentials in terms of its energy security, the fact it is zero emissions, the fact that it is a proven technology which is actually demonstrated and is a proven path to net zero, going just with solar panels or just with wind turbines. It has not been demonstrated that a developed major nation has been able to get to net zero just with solar panels or just with wind turbines, where rather with nuclear, there are countries, whether that with France or other nations, which have been able to demonstrate that. So I think as we start to consider the energy transition a bit more deeply, nuclear will always be there. So I don't think it's just a trend. I think more people will jump onto this boat as long as the industry still do their part and develop nuclear reactors.
Nuclear energy is here to stay, of course. That is the thing. But we can also fail. There's a chance that this is just a spoof, that the industry don't deliver, there's this momentum, and what will we then do?
The nuclear industry can't fail. The stakes have never been higher. We need nuclear energy globally to reach net zero. That is something that most bodies are telling us, whether it's the International Energy Agency or the IPCC. So if the nuclear industry does fail, they need to understand that that means that we're probably not going to get on track to reach our climate target, that the world could suffer energy poverty. So there is a huge imperative at this very moment for the nuclear industry to succeed. And hopefully they do understand the stakes, because if they're not able to do their job, and we're doing all we can to encourage them to be able to do their job and to help them succeed, if they're not able to do their job, then that's going to have huge consequences for all of us as youth advocates and all of our generation and future generations. So, you know, we better hope that they do their job. And I think we can be optimistic that when we know the stakes are so high at the moment, that they will hopefully realize that, start doing their jobs, and hopefully succeed.
Thank you so much. And William, you have the last words. What do you think of the future of nuclear in Australia? Do you actually think that you'll succeed and make the population understand that nuclear should be a part of the Australian energy mix?
As I said, I think the population is on side. They understand that nuclear energy should be considered as one of the options on the table. And I think that we've seen this, particularly in this year in Australia, in terms of our decision makers, our opposition parties just come out in support of nuclear energy. There's huge momentum behind nuclear. I don't see it going anywhere. I think it's only going to continue to progress towards us considering nuclear energy and lifting the bans. I'm optimistic that we will be able to lift the bans on nuclear energy in Australia. I don't think there's any justifications for them, especially when you consider the loopholes which are having to be made so that we can have our AUKUS submarines, which are, you know, the floating small modular reactors, which are going to be floating around our capital cities, providing power to our submarines for our national security. And then at the same time, we're going to have, our government will be spending hundreds of billions of dollars on those submarines, but this, at the same time, can't even consider nuclear reactors on land for our energy security. So I think at very least, the prohibitions are untenable. I'm very optimistic, and I hope that one day we will see a civil nuclear power reactor in Australia. I can't tell you when that will be, but when you consider the fact that Australia is a country which is home to many great innovations, you know, we were the creators of Wi-Fi, of penicillin, of Google Maps even, there's no reason why Australia couldn't take a technology like nuclear energy, put our spin on it, and be a world leader when it comes to nuclear, and also hopefully be a world leader in reaching net zero. So I maintain a deep optimism. Unfortunately, some of our decision makers are staunchly against nuclear, but I hope that we can at one point change their minds, and at one point Australia will have the option to be able to go nuclear.
And that's a great note to end on: optimism and hope for the future. And you're not pessimistic. All of you six fantastic young nuclear advocates, you're actually looking forward and you believe in there being a future for nuclear. Thank you so much for participating in this panel, from Roberto to Andre, Julia, Aurora, Mark, and William. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for listening.